Coming up on Garden Talk.
A hollow stem compared to a solid stem will relate to typically higher production in trichomes. If we can stress a female out and make her create nanners, then that means the hermaphroditic trait is dominant. Terpene profiles from that stem rub, I always stress that it's so important. One particular allele or one particular version per gene, that is homozygous status. That's what we want to achieve. When you see F2, 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 that's when we've opened up to the most choices of phenotypes. And our characteristics and our alleles is what we call them. That's when we start our selective breeding process. Don't get discouraged. Understanding it's going to take your time. Understand that you definitely are going to have a passion for it. You got to have a love for it because this is literally your life's work.
What's up, everybody? If you that don't know me, my name is Chris, aka Mr. Grow It, and you're tuned into the Garden Talk podcast. This is episode number 31. In this episode, I interview ZaZa Genetics. He has been gardening for 6 years, and he grows a variety of plants, such as collard greens, tomatoes, squash, kale, medicinal varieties, and watermelons. He is also a breeder, and that's what we're going to be getting into today. He's been breeding for 15 years, starting out with dogs, then transitioned over to plant breeding. In this podcast episode, he talks about plant breeding on an intermediate level. Thanks to all of you who support this podcast through Patreon. If you'd like to support, you can do so by going to patreon.com/MrGrowIt. Before we get into it, I want to acknowledge that one of my goals for this podcast is to bring zero cost for information about gardening, all plants, to the general public. That being said, I'd like to thank the sponsors of today's podcast to help make that goal possible. Dutch Pro is a sponsor of the podcast. Coupon code MrGrowIt10DP will get you a discount on their products. They are a plant fertilizer company that has been around for over 30 years. They originated in Amsterdam, and their nutrients are available in several countries across the world. They have everything needed for proper plant nutrition, from base nutrients to additives and pH regulators. I will leave a link to Dutch Pro's Amazon store down in the description section below. And don't forget to use coupon code MrGrowIt10DP for a discount on their products. A big supporter of this podcast is Spider Farmer. They sponsor this podcast, and I use their LED grow lights. Spider Farmer now has a bar-style series of LED grow lights. They have the SE3000, a 4-bar fixture for a 3-foot by 3-foot grow space, the SE5000, a 6-bar fixture for a 4-foot by 4-foot grow space, and the SE7000, a 6-bar fixture for a 5-foot by 5-foot grow space. I will leave a link to Spider Farmer down in the description section below, and you can use discount code MrGrowIt5 during checkout for a discount on their products. Thanks to AC Infinity for sponsoring this podcast. They sent me over their grow tent, which has a canvas density of 2000D, making them the thickest grow tent on the market today. It has an aluminum plate that mounts your controller to the grow tent with a lightproof pass-through for cable routing. The frame has 50% thicker steel poles and carries 2 times more weight than the standard grow tents. Coupon code MrGrowIt will get you a discount on their products, and I'll leave a link to their website down in the description section below. Alright, now let's get into the episode. Alright, we are back. Welcome to the Garden Talk podcast. Today I am joined with ZaZa from ZaZa Genetics. How you doing today?
Well, thank you for having me, man. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, glad to have you on. We're going to talk about breeding today. So I actually did a video with Vader OG from Ocean Grown Genetics. A while back, we did a beginner video on breeding. And this one, I feel like we're going to get more into more intermediate things. Now, some of these questions, some of the viewers might ask, and they might say, you've already talked about this on the last video. But a lot of things with breeding, I feel like, are subjective. Right? Like when we start talking about traits and stuff that breeders look for. So we're going to get into all of that. That's why some of those questions are asked on both that video as well as this video, or podcast episode, I should say. And then I did actually have people submitting questions through Instagram. So if you're not following me on Instagram, at Mr.Growit, follow me on there and you get a chance to ask questions in the future to future guests. So before we actually get into the nitty-gritty of plant breeding, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into gardening?
Yeah. So my name is Salam, originally from New Jersey, born and raised. So my initial passion for gardening started, ironically, sounds weird, but it started with dogs. We learned the family tree of dogs, and that kind of ended up learning through research that it was well connected with plants as well in gardening. My gardening experience started about 5 years ago, outdoors, vegetables, uh, kale, collard greens, all the good stuff. Especially, it kicked up really in the last couple of years with the whole virus thing and everything. Everybody wanted to kick up their immune system, and so we get into all the natural plants and medicines, and that's kind of where my gardening started about 5 years ago, outside actually with the vegetables.
Nice. And I know before we started recording, you had talked about how you started with dog breeding 15 years ago and how a lot of that knowledge actually transfers over to plants, which I thought was pretty interesting. And we're going to get deeper into it. I got to ask, in your opinion, what makes a reputable breeder? Why are you a reputable breeder? I thought that was a good question from somebody through Instagram that asked that.
Definitely. That's important too. That's a really good question. As far as me, transparency. Transparency and education. Like that's the most important thing. Being able to educate not only your friends and your fellow bromies or gardeners, but also if you have followers, if you have customers, whatever your niche is, whatever you have, educate. Each one teach one. And I think that's what makes a reputable breeder, being open with everybody you deal with.
Gotcha. Now, there was somebody who asked a question through Instagram. He's got a very small space, and he wants to know how much space do you need to microbreed, I guess you can call it, right? What's it like the smallest space that you can actually breed in?
Yeah, that's a new term, but it's new to me. But it doesn't take much space at all. That's the good thing about breeding. When you think in terms of gardening, you tend to need a lot of space as far as generally creating vegetables and flowers. You tend to need more space. But when it comes to making seeds, you don't need as much space. Typically, ideally, 2x4 tent. If you could, 2 tents would even be better. But that's pretty much all you would need.
What's your setup look like?
I run a 2x2. I'm sorry, 2x4. I also run a 4x4. I did have a 2x2 up, but I took it down. My mother, I have a mother, Mac 1, which typically got way too big. She's about 8 feet tall. She got way too big for her 2x2, so that we don't use anymore.
Gotcha. So as a home grower, you can definitely do breeding, just a couple tents. You can definitely get away with it. So that's cool to hear. Now let's talk about selection process. So this is where it's kind of like it gets into subjective, right? It comes down to breeder's preference. Okay, so starting with male plants, how do you select your male plants for breeding?
So male plants is a tricky one too, because typically you'll never really know. It's really hard to determine what traits a male is going to pass off to a female offspring. It's kind of like similar to like, if a dad is, it's going to be hard to look at a dad and say, I wonder what his daughter's bra size may be once she is born. Or, it's different. So it's really similar to that. And we have ways and tricks that we can kind of, use our best, kind of give us the best idea of what would be a good, true male breeder. And stem rub, stimulation of the, getting the idea of what those strong terpene profiles, and that typically will relate to good flavors and strong plants, ultimately medicine. And as well, hollow stem. A hollow stem usually, compared to a solid stem, will relate to typically higher content as far as production in trichomes, if that's something that you're interested in. And probably the biggest one, structure as well, structure and vigor. Vigor is probably the biggest one. A vigorous growing plant is going to be one that you want to use in your system, your line.
Gotcha. Now, I know some breeders, they'll stress their plants, whether they do training or some folks will let their plants grow naturally. Do you let your plants kind of grow naturally, Christmas tree style, or are you like training your plants and kind of stressing them out in certain ways to kind of help determine whether or not that's a selectable plant?
Absolutely. Stress testing is very important as well. At different stages, you definitely want to stress test the male for the selection process. And that's probably the only reason I would ever train a potential male for, breeding would be to, stress test, training, defoliating, bending, twisting, turning, all of that good stuff. That's pretty much, you would only do it for that reason, not necessarily for flower production.
Now, what about like feeding, I guess, kind of in relation to stress testing in a sense? Do you kind of give them like a lack of nutrients? I think some breeders do that. They'll run low on the nutrients, or they'll try to go heavy on the nutrients to kind of stress and see how the plant evolves and then kind of make their decision off of that. Do you do any of that? Or?
Well, spike in nitrogen is typically good. A really high spike in nitrogen, kind of give it a little overdose of nitrogen will be a good, stressor. I don't necessarily, me personally, I don't underfeed. It's, I think it'll take too long to kind of get the results that I'm looking for, as to where a spike in nitrogen is going to give you that instant kind of indication of this plant and whether it can, how hardy it is.
Okay, that makes sense. So the plant's been growing, male plant, you have identified male plant, you flipped it over to the light cycle, for example. Now it starts producing pollen sacs. Pollen sacs produce, the first time I ever grew a male plant, seeing the pollen sacs within a couple weeks and like opening within 3 weeks, like I thought it was just super quick, you know what I mean? I wasn't expecting that the first time around. Do you collect pollen and save it and store it for breeding in the future, or do you just let your males grow to a certain point, put them in with females, and kind of let them get down and dirty?
Yes, that's a good question too. So typically, ideally you want to do the latter. You want to be able to sit a male in there with the females, and ultimately, through my experience, I've seen a difference in seed production, bigger, beautiful seeds, and better offspring. Even the female, they seem to react to knowing that the male is in the tent with them. And they seem to perk up. They seem to be happier. It just seems like a better experience overall for the females. But that's always not ideal as far as, you can't always do it. So it's much more convenient to have pollen stored and be able to, just put it, or just pollinate the plant. Especially in the terms of when you have to store pollen for back crossing. Back crossing is very important when you're trying to stabilize a line. So that is, you have to store pollen for the most part in that sense.
Can you tell us how you store the pollen?
Well, I would pretty much, depending on whether it's autoflower or photoperiod, it's a really big difference. So, like you said, like a actual male plant is going to have an avalanche of pollen. Like it's going to be impossible not to, it's so easy to collect it. You pretty much just want to make sure that you dry it out and then store it within whether you want to store it long term, you want to put it in a freezer in a little glass jar, or or in a refrigerator if you plan to use it really soon. But autoflowers is a much more intricate process. Like you're going to really have to go in and actually use tweezers and pull the pollen sacs. In most cases, the pollen is much less viable. It's much less there. It's barely any. So you want to collect it by tweezers, as many as you can, pollen sac by pollen sac. At that point, I would then use a strainer, like a bowl strainer. I would use the bowl strainer and kind of shake everything I got in the bowl strainer to get the little bit of pollen. If I can get it that way, perfect. If not much comes out, then we got to kind of individually break each one open with the tweezers and remove each and every pollen sac, because that's when you get into moisture. Moisture can destroy pollen very easily, immediately, and make it non-viable. So you have to make sure that you, typically I use dehumidifiers as well when I'm collecting pollen. In that room, you want to lay it out flat on the table if possible, have a dehumidifier, keep the humidity at least 40 or below if possible. That's an ideal setting for pollen. And You want to let it dry out for a couple hours. Make sure it's completely dry. No pollen sacs are in there. Clean it out good, and then you can collect it once it's dry and stored. And like same way with regular mail with freezer or fridge.
Okay, that makes sense. Somebody through Instagram asked, and I don't know if this is true or not. They said they hear that keeping pollen in baking powder can help. So would mixing the pollen into baking powder in order to stabilize the humidity work?
I wouldn't do it personally. I've never heard that method myself personally, but it's not something. I mean, it's always something worth looking into. Or we learn every day, so I'll definitely be looking into that after the show. I'll tell you that.
Yeah, it was the first time I've ever heard of it either. I thought it was an interesting question to bring up. So let's get into female plants. So selecting the female. What do you do? What characteristics do you look for? So on and so forth.
So the female selection process is a lot more fun in my opinion. Everyone loves females. So in this case, it starts really early, and that's why that's why we use, or that's why I use the paper towel for germination. Is that's when the selection process starts. In many cases, if those tap roots don't come out really vigorous and strong, I'll put them to the side. Or I'll mark them. But, you want to start that selection process right there within that paper towel. And that's when the fun begins. You get to actually see and, you do the same stem rubs. But you know it's going to be a female. So you pretty much, it's a visible thing when you have multiple plants to select from. Typically, you just got to know what to look for.
So you're even from the beginning, you're killing off plants right away from when they're seed. Yeah. Now, are you looking for things while they're growing in veg, seedlings? Are you wiping out seedlings? I'm
wiping out seeds, yeah.
Wiping
actual
out
seeds. Yep, and not all the seeds are going to make it out of the paper towel. Even the ones that have decent tap roots, they may not. If I'm looking for real vigor, then I need to make sure I'm only picking the biggest, strongest ones with the biggest, strongest tap roots. And then from there, yeah, absolutely. We start the stress test on females pretty early as well. So because, that hermaphroditic trait that's when it'll come out in a female pretty early during the veg stage, whether it's light or, heat, or those are typically, I'll even use artificial wind, just blowing high winds on it and nitrogen spikes and things like that. They'll typically, if that trait is dominant, we just want to, we can bring it out pretty early during the veg stage in a female, pretty easily.
So you get the female plant growing all the way into flower. As it's going along, you're killing off plants. Are there any particular characteristics that you're looking for in the female plant? I don't know if you touched on that.
Typically the same that we look for within a male. Besides, it's just a lot more obvious, like trichome production. Of course, when you get those trichomes really early and all hanging out on the fan leaves, and those are always really good signs. Terpene profiles from that stem rub, I always stress that it's so important. On my lives, we always do it as a fun thing together. We get up there and we're all rubbing, and we're like, "Hey, oh my gosh!" It's always, but it's such an important thing because it really does give you those profiles and gives you an idea, and you can see the differences even within the same genes. You can see the differences and smell the differences, and that's a big selector for me. And but during the late flower stage, you just kind of just want to. You're focusing so much at that point. It begins so much on seed production at that point. So you kind of back off what we typically would normally be using for a normal medicinal plant in producing flower. The phosphorus and then the potassium, and we kind of back. I mean, potassium is okay, but the phosphorus and stuff we typically back off and kind of just keep running a little nitrogen and whatever else we may need. But at that point, yeah, you're pretty much already selected once you get to that stage.
Okay, so you've actually selected the female within the flower stage at the point where it needs to be pollinated. You don't actually grow a plant, take clones, finish off plants.
Oh, yeah. I'm a big clone. Well, yeah, for males mostly, we use cloning as a big for males. But with females, I don't necessarily have to cut as many clones. You always do as a precaution, typically just to be sure and always be able to go back. But males, sometimes you cut in 2 clones per male, just to make sure that they all get out there successfully. And, you want to test them and make sure. It's just a lot more testing clones with a male than it is a female.
Okay, so you are actually completing the female, smoking it, and then taking the clones of that female and using that to pollinate?
It's a lot of patience. Yeah, typically, all that's pretty much the whole program is cloning. Male and female, mostly cloning, because you got to be able to go back. In re-vegging, we do some re-vegging at times. With females, we re-veg. I particularly don't do it as much because we got cloning, as long as you're working with that's why I try to select early on in the process so we don't have too many females to have to clone from. But with males, you kind of, it's a much tougher process. I try to use other people to help me in that case when it comes to males, because males, you don't want to even sit them together, even separated from females, even them together, they'll even cross-pollinate each other. But you don't want pollen from one male being on another male that because it happens. So you want to actually separate them individually as well. It gets kind of tricky. So clones are very important.
Okay, that makes sense. And now, around what day of flower do you typically pollinate the females?
Well, we try to pollinate exactly around the time where we're seeing those first white pistils start to bunch up. We're seeing those white pistils because we know those are the pistils that typically catch that pollen. And whether if you have a male just hanging in there, you might want to, just shake a little bit in there. And, you always kind of want to start your male off earlier. You want to start the male off earlier. And because the female is going to take, especially with a regular male, it's not much you really have to do in that case, unless you've stored pollen and you're bringing it back to artificially inseminate.
Okay. And then what's the ideal flower time once pollinated for healthy seeds?
That's a good question. Yeah, so typically seeded flowers take longer to develop. They usually take longer than an unseeded female. And in general, 7 weeks, 8 weeks, typically, you'll generally know. It's when it comes to seeds in general, it's a really visual thing. Not really much you can sort of similar to trichomes. It's really visual thing. Once you see the casing kind of crack, or you kind of visually see the seed. It looks like it's developed based on color and size. That's pretty much all your determining factors right there.
I gotta imagine that genetics has something to do with it as well, right? If you have like a 12-week flowering strain, right? It would probably need to go longer than the 7-8 weeks that you mentioned. So, but yeah, I mean, I think you bring up a good point. Is like, because I'm a breeder. Yeah, I don't call myself a breeder, but Vader OG called me a breeder because I did one cross. I made one cross. It was Brisker OG crossed with Pakistan Valley. So technically I'm a breeder, but I know exactly what you mean when you say that. It's kind of like you can see like the calyx is open with the seed popping out, and you can see like the color of the seeds and so on and so forth. So you can kind of get an idea then. It's visible. So I totally understand what you mean by that one. So. Okay, so I know the answer to this next question, but I'm still going to ask it just because there's an audience here that probably doesn't know the answer. Some people don't know the answer. Should pollen from a female producing nanners be used for breeding? So the bananas, the male stamen that comes out.
It depends on how the nanners were created. So if we have purposely stressed the female to create nanners in a sense of like light stress or heat stress, that's not. And then we bring that hermaphroditic trait out to the forefront, then it was dominant in the first place, right? So we don't want to use that for breeding stock. Now, in the sense where nanners were created by the female herself in that last-ditch effort to, self-pollinate and preserve her own genetics, in that sense, she wasn't that most likely that hermaphroditic trait wasn't dominant in her. She did it herself. Towards the end, thinking like, oh, this is the end of my life cycle. I got to pollinate. I haven't been pollinated. Got to pollinate. So in that sense, it's really good because technically that's self-pollination, which the offspring of every self-pollination are going to be 50% more stable. So that's why I say it gets tricky when we use the term hermaphrodite or Hermie. It's really important in knowing how it was developed. And, we got two different type of Hermies technically. We have ball sacks, which typically come from us reversing a female, whether we're using colloidal silver or gibberellic acid or whatever method you're using, we're then stopping the product, the production of ethylene and causing the female to then create male parts. So in that case, that's also not, the hermaphroditic trait most likely is not dominant in that case. It's most likely recessive and, depending on, it could be either way, but, you would know if in that case, because we wouldn't use it in the first place. But in that case, yeah, it's most likely not dominant. It would be dominant in the case where we use stress to create Nanners. Yeah, that's not good. We don't want to use that as breeding stock.
Okay, we'll get deeper into feminizing in a little bit here. I want to stick on hermaphrodites for a few more questions here. So, should pollen from pollen sacs coming from a hermaphrodite, so the hermaphrodite I'm talking about is, say the plant grows, flip it over to flower, starts growing pistils, shortly after you see pollen sacs there, should that be used for breeding?
No. So that is what we're talking about in the case of a natural herm.
Yep. Okay.
That's more of a natural herm where that trait is dominant in that. So that's going to also pass off that dominant trait to the offspring. And many of those offspring are going to have, or just like you said, go on the flower and produce pollen sacs.
And then you did mention through Instagram that it's important to understand the hermaphroditic trait. What are some other things that we should kind of know about that you haven't talked about yet?
Yeah, just knowing and being able to ask the qualifying questions to a breeder. So in many cases, growers, they get the Hermie, hermaphroditic trait, and they panic and they say, "Oh, what's going on?" The breeder's blaming you. They're blaming the lights. They're blaming the humidity or the environment. The grower's like, "No, it's you. You got bad genetics. You're not stable." So we have to find a medium, and the medium is education. So if you know what to look for and you know what to expect and you know why this may have hermied in the first place, then you're in a much better position, as to no one having to point the finger and say, because you say, hey, well, maybe I might have let this female, sit for a little bit longer than I normally should have, and I could tell that's probably why I may have 6 or 7 seeds in the bud here, but or if you're dealing with unstable genetics. And that is a thing. That is a real thing. And that's why when we're dealing with F1s and we're really dealing with unstable, even with F2s, we're dealing with a large variety of genetics. So you want to really do your best to take your time and be patient and stabilize your genetics as much as possible, so that it goes both ways, and you got to meet in the middle with education. So,
okay, that's good info. Feminized seeds. Let's move on to them. They're becoming more and more popular. People love to be able to plant a seed, and just about always, guaranteed that it's going to be female 9 times out of 10, or maybe 9.9 times out of 10. How do you create feminized seeds?
Through reversing the female and stopping the production of ethylene. The ethylene, once you stop it or once you slow it down, the female starts to create pollen sacs and male parts. And that's what, at that point, we can typically pollinate the female and create feminized seeds. So all the offspring will be female offspring.
And there are several different ways you can do that, right? Do you want to touch into the different ways, colloidal silver, gibberellic acid? Can you talk to us about those ones?
Yeah, so colloidal silver is probably the more popular one. Something you can actually even make at home. I mean, I don't make it myself. I do typically make my own mixtures of colloidal silver and gibberellic acid. I try different things, but typically you can go with 50 parts per million, 40 parts per million colloidal silver, which is actually silver, silver and distilled water, a little bit of conductivity in there, and then you got colloidal silver. Um, that's pretty much my recommended method. That is probably the most popular method, in my opinion. So it's pretty simple. That's typically how most breeders will reverse a female.
When would you apply that?
I would start around 2 weeks, 3 weeks vegetative stage. You want to start. You want to start as early as possible. You want to hit the corners. You want to hit as much. It depends. I mean, how you have different methods of reversing as well. Some breeders might just want to reverse one plant. One branch rather. I'm sorry, one branch. As to where, me typically I'll reverse the entire plant. So I start really early. I just start spraying the entire plant. But if you're more concerned about just one branch, then you might start just focusing on that one branch, covering the rest of it, and being able to spray that one branch in about 3 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks, and some people 2 to 3, 4 times a day. It's kind of up to you, and it's really strain specific. You know that it's pretty strain specific. Some strains are really hardy where they don't like to be reversed, so you may have to apply a stronger solution more times per day. And some are really sensitive to it. But that's typically the method we use.
Okay, so you're spraying in veg, and then are you flipping to flowering, letting them flower, and still continuing to spray, or when do you stop that spray?
It depends on autoflower or photo period. So in the case of an autoflower, you kind of know when she's reversed. When she starts growing those balls or pollen sacs, you can stop with. And with a male, or I'm sorry, a photo period, you want to just start in about give it about 3-4 weeks of about a month of spray, flip it to flower, and continue for about another 2 weeks, and you should see the results probably within a week or two.
So basically, what will happen? The plant will start producing nanners, right, and then you would harvest the nanners, or how does that? Or it would self-pollinate, and then it would just grow seeds on that particular plant.
Well, in the case of a reverse female, she's gonna grow actual pollen sacs like a male would.
Okay.
So yeah, we're actually stopping the process of ethylene, which causes her to kind of turn into half male. So in that case, it's not necessarily nanners. Nanners are always gonna be related to stress. Whether it's bad stress that we caused or whether it's stress that the female caused on her own. But those we don't want to collect for. We don't want to collect nanners for pollen to use as we don't want to breed those. We only want to breed male pollen sacs, balls. So we can kind of relate it to that. If it doesn't have if it's not balls, then we don't want to use it to breed.
Gotcha. How about gibberellic acid?
Gibberellic acid, yeah. I don't use it as much. I use it a little bit in a mixture that I've tried, that I'm working on, but I don't recommend it. I only recommend colloidal silver, because that's what I've always used, and that's what I'm just starting to try a new mixture, but either way, I always go back to just colloidal silver. We try to experiment with different things all the time, but that's how we learn.
Yep. What's the best way to stress a female without using chemicals?
Stress a female without using chemicals. If you want to stress test.
Stress in order to kind of get them to, I guess, self-pollinate and create feminized seeds, right?
Okay. So a female is going to self-pollinate on her own. So for anybody interested in wanting to get into stabilized, first-time breeders, I would recommend self-pollination, being that rhodolization is what is a term. Rhodolization is where we typically will let the female plant take a little bit longer than we necessarily would, and we'll end up with some seeds out of that. So that's going to be stable. It's going to be 50% more stable, the offspring, than the mother plant was, as well as, it's a good way to kind of get your feet wet. But we don't ever want to stress a female out purposely to use her pollen to create, because if we can stress a female out and make her create nanners, then that means the hermaphroditic trait is dominant in her genes. So we don't want she's not breeding stock in that case. We want to put her to the side. We don't want to use that.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting. That was I was going to say that was a listener question. It was through Instagram.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good question because it does get really tricky. And that's why I always stress to get as much education as we can as far as the hermaphroditic trait and nanners and pollen sacs and the difference between the two and how nanners are created, how pollen sacs can be created, and how they relate to feminized seeds. Because everyone loves feminized seeds. It's like, I want feminized. You got feminized? I want feminized. And I'm like, sometimes I'm a pain because I'm like, hey, check this article out. If you don't know, do you know about this? And why do you really want feminized seeds? Do you understand the risk in the risk in feminized seeds? Because it is a little bit of risk. We're dealing with hermaphroditic traits, and so you want to go in. And when you go to a breeder and you're asking them for feminized seeds, I also want my team to be able to ask those follow-up questions. Well, what generation has your feminized seeds been bred to? How long have you? What are some of the traits that you breed for within your feminized seeds? What's the chances that I might get nanners during early in the flower stage? Now you ask a breeder these type of questions, and they're like, hold up. Either they're going to be legitimate or they're going to back off and say, you know what, I don't want your business. Get out of here. And that's the kind of we want that on both ends. We want to be educated.
Makes sense. Yeah, just one last thing on that last question. This particular person said that the question was, how do you stress a female to herm without using chemicals? He had mentioned he's been using light to do that. He'll move it from 12-12 to 18-6 for a couple days and then back to 12-12. So you're saying that you shouldn't do that because it's stressing the plant?
You could do it. So we do that to look for sexual stability. So that's the only time I use light or heat in order to stress a female, because I want to see if she's sexually stable or not. Now, if I put light on her and she withstands it and she doesn't hurt me, then she's sexually stable. So she's good breeding stock. But if I put light on her and heat on her and she herms out, then I'm cutting her. She's no good. She's bad. Because if I use her to breed, if I use that pollen that was so easy to flip like that into a herm, then that pollen is also going to be, or the offspring are also going to have that trait dominant within their genes.
Gotcha. And you mentioned heat. Can you talk to us about a little bit more, like how much heat, like when do we apply it, so on and so forth, in order to stress it that way?
Yeah, 85 and up. I would say 89, 90. Any 90 and up is a good indicator of heat stress. If you can go to 100 if you can, but anything above 89, I would say, is typically 90, depending on your environment, depending on the strain. Everything is really strain related too. Especially we can get deep with that indica and sativa, related stuff, and so it's so related to that and how they handle heat and stresses. But I would say 90s is a good stressor. But yeah, light is definitely a good stressor. You can apply light and definitely flip a female to herm, but once she does that, she's no good. Good
info. Okay, good to know. Autoflower seeds, another popular thing. Autoflower, more and more.
Everybody's favorite.
Yeah. So how do you create those seeds?
Same way. Those are generally feminized seeds. Most likely, they are regular as well, but the popularity of feminized seeds and autoflower have kind of ran neck and neck. So now we just got feminized autoflower everywhere. And same process, we reverse a female with colloidal silver and use that pollen, collect that pollen. It's a much more intricate, like I said, it's a much more difficult process. Requires much more patience and much more time consuming. But that's where you want to use definitely have your tweezers handy and be able to collect each individual pollen sac as they develop, and collect as much pollen as possible to be able to use and store, if it's even enough to store. But that's when it gets tricky, autoflowers.
There's more and more seed banks and breeders that are releasing autoflowers, and they don't actually end up being autoflowers. So stability comes into question, and I heard you have to breed multiple levels down in order to stabilize. What exactly does it mean to stabilize a variety?
So to stabilize is simply just reducing genetic variability, just reducing variability. Ultimately, we want to achieve homozygous status. We want to achieve homozygosity, in a sense, where that's just one phenotype, one particular alleles or one particular version per gene. And that is homozygous status. That's what we want to achieve through generations of selective breeding. We dumb it down to just one phenotype, and that's what it is to stabilize the strain.
Okay, and then for autoflowers in particular, I heard you need, like I mentioned, you need to go down multiple generations. Is it like 4 generations down, or what was do you know?
Well, either way, it's multiple generations if you're stabilizing a strain. You're never going to be able to stabilize a strain without going down multiple F2, F3, F4, F5. You may get, and that's the thing too. So stabilizing is also in the sense of the breeder. What you may consider stable may not be stable to me. So you may think like, hey, I got my greens, I got my vigor, I got my big buds, I'm stable, but most important is sexual stability. We have to however long it takes to selective breed and inbreed or line breed or inbred line, IBL, in terms of what we call it, IBL. We have to go down that line in IBL for several generations until we remove the hermaphroditic trait, as well as try to catch all of the things that we like. Trichome develop or production. You may want purple buds as well, but all of those are secondary to sexual stability. And sexual stability takes years. That takes 4, 5, 6, 7 generations. You can pick up on the cool stuff along the way, but until you run into that roadblock of after about the eighth F8, F7, F8, you'll run into a roadblock of being technically sterile, where you're like, okay, now I'm sexually stable, but no further I can go. That's when we back cross. That's when we go back to the parent. We bring out that stored pollen, and then we can go back and re-enter some of those traits that we loved in the beginning. That's the correct way to do it. But yeah, it's going to take years no matter what. If you want to have a good line, it's going to take years.
That makes sense. Good information there. Okay, so next one is another listener question. It has to do with the chart. So I'm going to put this chart on the screen right now. If you're watching on YouTube, if you are on one of the podcast platforms, maybe you can explain it for them. This chart that I'm showing right now, you can see, from the top, P1 male, P1 female, and then it goes down. You get your F1s, your F2s, F3s, F4s, F5s, F6, and then actually it connects back to a P1 new generation. First, could you explain this chart for us in layman's terms?
All right, so P1 is going to be the parent generation. That's where we're starting off with mother and father. So that is where we're basically starting off the generation, the outcross of the mother and the father. That is the start of that generation, and that's those offspring are going to get us into F1. All right. Those offspring are going to get us to F1. So the difference between F1 and F2 is F1 is the start using the parents. F2 is the actual start of the line, of the inbred line using the offspring. So in this case, when you see F2, 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 that's when we've opened up to the most variety, the most choices of choosing our phenotypes. and our characteristics and our alleles is what we call them, our versions of what we. That's when we start our selective breeding process, that F2 generation, and then from there is what you pretty much see is the selective process of him picking or whoever it is picking certain offspring there, and breeding them together. And as we go down, we just run into different generations at attempts to stabilize the strain. You got A, M. These are all characteristics that are being selectively bred for. We go down in the F4, F4, F4. So yeah, he kind of stops in F6, and that's typically at that point where I would generally back cross back to the parent. And that's where you see P1 all over again. So it's funny. That's how we spoke just about that right before. So that's cool. Really cool chart. That's genetic mapping right there. That's what we use for that's what we use for reference.
Gotcha. So definitely a good chart to have on hand.
Absolutely.
The question that had in regards to this chart is, if two parents are bred together, which level of generational offspring will show the strongest level of expressions and terpenes?
Okay. So that is an awesome question, but we're not necessarily going to. So you'll get the most variety in the F2 generation. So you'll probably find your best options and your strongest terpenes and variety right there in the F2 generation, because you'll have more to choose from.
Okay.
So that's what we want to start our hunt for. That's what we want to start looking in the F2s.
A lot of people think it's F1s that are,
Really?
you know what I mean? I think that was some misinformation that was passed around.
Yeah, it shows you right here in the chart. You see the F1 is only limited amount of offspring compared to F2, where we have a wide variety. We kind of open up the gene pool at that point, and we get such a wide selection. And that's where we start the selective breeding process to say, hey, because we're going to get instability as well. We get a wide variety where we get instability. So now we have to focus on selective breeding and making sure that we stabilize or work towards stabilizing by picking the right offspring.
Now, what's your opinion on breeders releasing F1s versus releasing F2s versus, is there something that they should only release, stability purposes, for example? Do you feel like, in your opinion, that breeders should only release stable genetics that are, F5s, F6s, or whatever?
That's a good question, but I can't say that I would suggest people only, because we need genetics too. We need to experience. We need to experience. So if everything was stable, it's like that would be a perfect world, right? We don't want to live in a perfect world. We want to be able to experience these things and apply some of the education that we learned into right there, hands on, and to be able to do that. I don't have anything against F1s, but you gotta educate. Like me personally, I educate my people and say, hey, this is an F1. Typically, I only offer it in a certain way, typically like an auction or something like that. But and when I do, I make sure that they understand, like, hey, and it's sort of like when I did with dogs. If I sold you a puppy, I'm like, man, hey, you gonna send me pictures? Or you're like, I'm calling every week. They're like, all right, man, she's good. But that's kind of the same way with the genetics. You want to, it's like your offspring or your children. You kind of want to follow up and make sure that the new parents, they're okay, they're well taken care of, and that they don't run into any issues. So typically when you do that, it's not a problem giving out F1s. You just got to keep a good relationship, and customer service is always first.
Okay, that's a good answer. Talking about dogs, I want to touch on this real quick, and it doesn't have to be a long answer, but can you tell us like some of the things that are the same for dog breeding and plant breeding, and then also some things that are different for dog breeding versus plant breeding?
Yeah, for sure. Literally, when it comes to the genetics of it, everything is exactly the same besides being able to reverse. That's literally the only thing that's different. Even when we come down to cloning, you can clone a puppy, especially nowadays. That's why eventually we're evolving into the tissue culture. And people clone puppies using tissue culture, and through our gardening, we'll eventually start to see people preferably creating their clones through tissue culture because you can store it for much longer. It's that much similar to where there's only literally one difference as far as that I can tell. Being able to reverse a female. I don't really know anything else that's different. XY chromosomes, everything's literally the same. Even some of the terminology that I learned years ago through, it connected, and I'm like, wow, okay. Like hybrid vigor, and it's a different term in the dog world, but it means sort of the same thing in the plant world.
That's interesting. Yeah, I was just curious on that one. So I have a few more questions for you. What advice do you have for someone who's a beginner breeder or someone who's considering starting to breed?
Have fun, man. Have fun. Don't get discouraged. Understanding it's going to take your time. Understand that you definitely are going to have a passion for it. You got to have a love for it because this is literally your life's work. So, and when you look at it as your life's work and you have fun with it at the same time, nothing else really matters, man. Do it for fun. Do it for your own personal use, for your own medicine, for the own love. Your love of it, the love of the gardening, and you'll be fine.
I like that. I think that's really good advice for sure. So wrapping things up, how can the listeners find you, and what do you got upcoming in the future?
On Instagram, the real ZaZa Genetics on Instagram. Follow us. You can follow me, any of my team. Shout out to my team. It's so important to me. Miss Blunt Love Reviews, Carrot Top Crops, No Limit Edibles. These are all people that are so important to me. But yeah, so we have a couple collaborations going on with THC Tone, Greenhouse Huey. We got some major collaborations. Tino's Genetics. We got some collaborations going on with these guys coming up really soon. And other than that, you can find us on Instagram.
Cool. I'll link his Instagram down in the description section below, so you can click on that, give him a follow. ZaZa, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast today.
Thank you, it's been a pleasure, man. I appreciate you.
Definitely learned quite a bit here, and I thought it was pretty interesting here about the crossover with the dog breeding as well. And we got deep into some things that I wasn't expecting to get that deep into, so I'm really glad that I had you on the podcast today, dropping some knowledge, so really appreciate that. If you guys enjoyed this episode, click that thumbs up button. As many thumbs up as possible. Trying to get the YouTube algorithm to show up in people's suggested feeds, and that helps. Commenting helps. Sharing helps. If you, for some reason, are not subscribed to the channel, click that subscribe button. Post these podcast episodes every single week. Usually it's on Saturdays. Sometimes it's on Sundays. But every single weekend, we post a new podcast episode, not just on YouTube, but we're also on podcast platforms, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, just about anywhere podcast platforms are available. This podcast is available. And if you're on Apple Podcasts in particular, please leave a rating and review. We passed 100 ratings and reviews, going for 200. If you're listening on there and you want to take a minute to leave a rating and review, I would greatly appreciate it. Once again, ZaZa, thank you so much for coming on, just dropping some serious knowledge bombs on this podcast episode. I think it was great. Hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Yes, sir. Truly humble, man. Have a blessed day, brother.
Thanks.